Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Sonya. With me is Truth in My Days director John Torres for an in-depth discussion of the origins of the Gospel according to John. So we've already discussed the dates of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why are these dates important?
Well, as we discussed last time, it's the issue of the credibility of the gospel books. If they were actually written by eyewitnesses, the apostles, Matthew, Peter through his agent Mark, Luke, who was not directly an eyewitness but had, by his own testimony, received his information from eyewitnesses, that enhances their credibility. It makes them believable. And this is why liberal skeptics for a long time have been trying to claim that the gospel books were written very late. They must remove them from the time of eyewitnesses, because then you could say, well, who are these people? What are they writing down? How would they know? So we did discuss the fact that they challenged the authorships of these books, and we showed that the evidence is clear, that they were indeed written by the apostle Matthew, Mark, the co-worker of Peter, writing Peter's testimony, and Luke, who was a Gentile and co-worker of the apostle Paul. And as well, the gospel according to John was written by the apostle John, one of the inner circle of Jesus' apostles, and in fact, the closest personal friend of Jesus. So this gives them great credibility, even as historical documents testifying to Jesus' ministry, his miracles, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection from the dead. Now, if they were not written in the lifetimes of these people, then of course their credibility goes down. If they're written too late to have been written by eyewitnesses, too late to come from eyewitness times, then their credibility is shot. And so liberal scholars settled on claiming that the gospel books were all written in the 2nd century, working off of claims from F.C. Bauer, which never was actually backed up by evidence. They claimed that the first gospel book, Matthew, was written in AD 130. Off the top of his head, he picked the date of Jesus' crucifixion, as he thought, and added 100 years just to take the dates out of eyewitness times. And so for a very long time, they made these claims. They were buttressed by no evidence, and yet we were told that these are the assured results of critical scholarship. Now, as we discussed last time, liberals told us that the gospel according to John had to be the last one written, and it could not possibly have been written before the year AD 160, probably closer to 170. And this took a big hit in 1936, when a small fragment was published by Colin H. Robert, a small papyrus fragment that turned out to be from the Gospel according to John and dated, according to the scholars of the time, to the latest possible date of AD 125. Well, that put it 45 years before what liberal skeptics had said about John, 35 years after the earliest possible date. So it showed that liberal scholarship really is not based on evidence. And it forced them to admit that all of the gospel books were written, in fact, in the 1st century, which puts them into eyewitness times. They would go back to AD 70. They were willing to go back that far at least, and no further, maybe a few years to AD 66. And unfortunately, as we saw, evangelicals tended to go along with those what are relatively late dates.
Why AD 70?
Why AD 70? Because Matthew and Mark contain a prophecy of Jesus where he talks about the temple, that it would be destroyed, not one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. And that came to pass in the year AD 70 when the Romans totaled the city of Jerusalem. And so if these books were written before 70, it would mean that there was a genuine predictive prophecy from Jesus that came true. And this is something that liberal scholars who deny the supernatural are not willing to accept. So AD 70 became the cutoff line. Now they're willing to go back perhaps a little bit further, as far as AD 66, when the Jewish uprising against the Romans began, and they would say, well, maybe a clever person could have foreseen what's happening with no supernatural abilities. So they date these quite late. Evangelicals unfortunately tend to follow suit. They might put a little bit earlier than the liberal skeptics do, but again, not based on evidence.
Okay, so in your program, you actually looked at evidence then.
Yes, that's what needs to be done. If you're going to put forth dates, you need to be able to give reasons for them. And we looked, as you recall, at both internal and external evidence.
So what does internal evidence and external evidence mean again? Can you remind us?
Certainly. Internal evidence is evidence you find within the writing itself, things that are said or things that should be said and are not mentioned, that allow us to put dates on the written documents, at least perhaps an earliest possible and a latest possible date. For example, if you come across some written source talking about World War I, you know that this has to have been written in 1939 or later, because World War I was not called World War I until there was a World War II. There was no reason to call it that. So from the time of the beginning of World War I, as we know it, it was called the Great War or the World War. No one, as I say, called it World War I until there was a World War II. So that would be internal evidence that will allow you to set at least an earliest and latest possible date. If you're reading a sports report that said that the Toronto Raptors are the defending NBA champions, you would know that this had to have been written somewhere between June 13th, 2019 and October 11th, 2020. June 13th, 2019 is when the Raptors won Game 6 against the Golden State Warriors and became champions. October 11th, 2020 was the date when the Lakers defeated Miami and became the new champions. And since the Raptors won only that one time, we can date this writing based on what it says here about the NBA champions. So that's what we mean by internal evidence, things that are written in the documents that allow us to set at least the minimum and maximum possible dates. Other sorts of internal evidence are things that are not mentioned that should be mentioned. And we looked at the book of Acts. And Acts ends after this lengthy description of Paul arrested in Jerusalem, spending time under arrest, and then eventually being taken to Rome. And then in Rome, we're told that he spent 2 full years under house arrest. And this is where the book of Acts ends. We're not told of how Paul's trial in Rome turned out. Remember, he was sent to Rome because he appealed to Caesar after the Jews were bringing charges against him. And so the question is, why does the book of Acts end where it ends? And the only reasonable explanation is there was nothing more to write at that time. Paul was there. Luke, the writer of Acts, had no idea how long this was going to continue before something would happen. He wanted to publish the book, so he published it. So the internal evidence will tell us that Acts dates to the year 62. The destruction of the temple that we mentioned, it's reasonable to assume that if this had happened by the time of writing, it would have been mentioned by the author that this was fulfilled. We have, for example, in Acts chapter 11, a very minor prophecy by one Agabus recorded and its fulfillment mentioned. So we think it would be fulfilled. That's what we mean by internal evidence. External evidence is what we can find either from the manuscripts themselves or from early historians, early church writers addressing the issue. And we showed that there is footnotes, colophons, in a set of manuscripts, medieval manuscripts called Family 35, which give us specific dates for the gospel book's publication. Matthew, we were told, was 8 years after the Ascension, which would put it to AD 40 to 41. Mark was 10 years after the Ascension, so 42 to 43. Luke, 15 years after the Ascension of Jesus, so 48 to 49. And John, 32 years after the Ascension.
Could somebody argue that the people who made those footnotes, those colophons, could have lied to make the dates look better?
They could argue that. I haven't heard anyone argue that, because at the time of these were written, nobody was questioning these. Attacks on the historicity of the gospel books, attempts to discredit them, challenge the authorship, push the dates late, even talk about the dates, didn't really arise until the Enlightenment times. So there was no need to make the books look better at the time these colophons were written.
Okay, so how come in that talk you didn't talk about the gospel according to John, only the other gospels?
Well, the gospel according to John doesn't actually record Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple, which means you have to look at different factors. Now, it's not mentioned by Eusebius. We talked about the fact that Eusebius also gives the dates for the publications of Matthew and Mark, and they dovetail exactly with what we see in the Family 35 colophons, but Eusebius doesn't give us a specific date for the gospel according to John's publication, which is why, as I say, we have to look at different bases for setting a date.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess it's true that the gospel according to John seems to be quite different from the other three. We don't see parables or exorcisms or cleansing lepers or transfiguration, and it seems to be more about who Jesus is, like especially that he's deity, and tells you how to be saved.
Yes, that's certainly the case. I think anyone who reads the gospel books notices this difference. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have their own differences among them, but they largely cover the same areas, the same points of Jesus' ministry, and John is quite different. And liberal skeptics have jumped all over this for a long time to try to discredit the gospel according to John, because they will say that these kind of things that you find here in John, the deity of Jesus and salvation by faith, that these are later developments. These are not things that Jesus himself taught. Now, do understand that the deity of Jesus is taught throughout the New Testament. You find indications of it in the other gospel books. You find them in the epistles. Liberal scholars all claim that Paul's letters were the earliest writings. And certainly Paul teaches these same things about Jesus. So to me, this attack is a non-starter. But they do make the attack. And they will say that these kind of ideas, they were not taught by Jesus. They were not taught by his apostles. These are things that were legendary accretions. They were ideas, legends that developed through a long period of time. And this is why Bauer put the gospel according to John at such a late date, because he said that it would take this long for these kind of ideas about Jesus to develop. And that is why the date of the gospel according to John is such a crucial thing to look at. If it's much earlier than the liberal skeptics claim, if it is in eyewitness times, then the idea that these teachings of Jesus are legendary accretions, things he never actually taught, that goes out the window. It's no longer a sustainable critique. So liberal skeptics really try to use this to attack the credibility of John. Bart Ehrman, the famous former evangelical who's now an agnostic and was spending his career trying to tear down the credibility of Christianity, writes that in Mark's gospel, Jesus is not interested in teaching about himself. But when you read John's gospel, that's virtually the only thing Jesus talks about is who he is, what his identity is, where he came from. This is completely unlike anything that you find in Mark or in Matthew and Luke, and historically it creates all sorts of problems. That's what Ehrman says. Robert W. Funk of the Jesus Seminar flatly asserts that, quote, the two pictures painted by John and the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, cannot both be historically accurate. The words attributed to Jesus in the fourth gospel are the creation of the evangelist for the most part and reflect the developed language of John's Christian community. Another well-known liberal scholar, James D.G. Dunn, says few scholars would regard John as a source for information regarding Jesus' life and ministry in any degree comparable to the Synoptics. E.P. Sanders, the Gospel of John contains an advanced theological development in which meditations of the person and work of Jesus are presented in the first person as if Jesus said them. Geza Vermes discounts all the teaching in John when reconstructing his view of the authentic gospel of Jesus. And in fact, evangelicals get caught up in this as well. I remember seeing one time there was a discussion between the same Armin and the evangelical scholar Craig Evans. And Armin was asserting that the I am statements in John, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the door, his I am statements, Armin said these are not true. Jesus never said these, and our evangelical scholar agreed. Yep, never said them. So you see, it goes from pointing out differences, then claiming that the differences are irreconcilable, and from that claiming then that everything in John is not true. Now, Christians have been reading the gospel books for centuries, many centuries. We all notice the differences between what Matthew, Mark, Luke say and what John says, but we don't see it as incompatible because they're not. Once again, we have these bald assertions from the liberals that you cannot reconcile them, and that's simply not true. And again, for this to work, they have to push the date of John late, which again, why this is so important for us to look at the actual evidence for the date of publication of the Gospel according to John.
Okay, but why is the Gospel according to John so different in focus?
That's a good question. And the reason is because the authors had different goals and different target audiences for their books. Let me give you an analogy to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Hockey is Canada. Canada is hockey. For a long time, from the formation of Canada onwards, it was the one thing we did better than everybody else. It's the one thing that just about everybody in Canada was involved in one way or the other, either playing or taking their kids to play, or watching, listening on the radio. Hockey was Canada, and we were so dominant. First Winter Olympics in 1924, Canada beat Czechoslovakia in their first game 30-0, then beat Sweden 22-0, then beat Switzerland 33-0, and then beat Great Britain in the semifinal 19-2, and then waxed the US 6-1 in the gold medal final. Yeah, and that continued for a long time until 1954, the Soviet Union showed up for the first time, beat Canada, and became the world champions. And we couldn't win again after 1961. And we knew why. The Soviets were sending their top professionals. We couldn't. It's Olympics, World Championships. We were only able to send our amateurs, who were not our top tier players, not our second tier, third tier, fourth tier. And then in 1972, and every Canadian over a certain age remembers this, a series was set up, an 8-game series between Canada and the Soviet Union, where each side could use their top professionals, and that would settle hockey supremacy. And when Canada lost the first game in Montreal, 7-3, the whole country went into shock. And the whole country came together. Like nothing grabbed Canada's interest in history, with the possible exception of wartime, nothing. And then in the end, Canada's trailing 3-1, 3 games left to go, and they win game 6. Paul Henderson gets the winning goal. Game 7, still trailing 3-2 now. It's late in the game. The score is tied 3-3. If Canada cannot score, they cannot win the series. And then Paul Henderson again scores a spectacular goal with just over 2 minutes to play. The series is tied, comes down to game 8. 1 game, winner take all for hockey supremacy. And through 2 periods, Soviets are leading 5-3. We had 20 minutes left to say we were the best, and then we would lose it. And in the 3rd period, Canada scored, and then scored again. And it went down to the last minute, when Paul Henderson scored. Canada won the series by the skin of their teeth. Paul Henderson, he was the toast of the town. He was the toast of the country at that time. He could have run for prime minister and been elected. And he received so many accolades. In time, commemorative postage stamps were made, commemorative coins, streets were named after him. But the funny thing with Henderson is he was at the absolute pinnacle that his career offered. The things that the world said were important, he had it. And he got to this level in hockey that was previously unimaginable. He'd gone beyond anything any other player had done. He had the accolades, he had the fame, he had the adulation, he had the money, he had everything the world says you need to be happy, and he wasn't. He could see how empty it was. He became a bitter man until eventually Christ found him, and he became a Christian. Now, the series, of course, has been analyzed, hashed, rehashed through almost 50 years now. So many books were written on the series. I've read so many of them. Let me point out 3 of them to you. Okay. There's one called Face Off at the Summit, written by Ken Dryden, who was one of Canada's goalies. Hockey Showdown, written by Harry Sinden, who was the coach of Team Canada. There's this other one called Cold War, written by Roy McSkimming. Now, 3 books about the series. Okay. One is written by a direct participant, Ken Dryden. One written by a direct participant, though not a player. And one written by an outsider who would be getting his information from eyewitnesses. So I picked these 3 because it's very much like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of the accounts is eyewitness testimony written by somebody who's directly, most closely involved, the goalie. One written by somebody, okay, so that would be like something like Mark, okay, because he's writing Peter. Peter is the closest. If you look at the letter, the name here on the cover, it says, Face Off at the Summit by Ken Dryden with Mark Mulvoy. So Mark Mulvoy is doing the actual writing of Ken Dryden's memoirs. And that's like the Gospel according to Mark. Mark is writing the memoirs of Peter, the direct participant.
And here nobody would doubt that Ken Dryden is actually the eyewitness, even if someone did the writing for him.
Exactly. And Harry Sinden, the coach, his would correspond to the Gospel according to Matthew, one of the direct participants, but not one of the real inner core participants. Roy McSkimming's would correspond to the Gospel according to Luke, written by somebody who's not an eyewitness, but getting information from eyewitnesses. And if you read these 3 books, you're going to find very, very great similarities. They all cover the same territory. They all talk about the same thing. They'll all go into a bit of background, how the series came to be. Then they will go into great detail on the results of each game and how it happened. They will include some stuff about what happened in between, media reactions, and so on. The great focus will be on Game 8 and Henderson's winning goal, and then a little bit of aftermath. All very similar. Now here's a 4th book on the series. It's called Shooting for Glory, and it's written by Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson, I guess, would have the strongest inside view on the series as the scorer of those 3 winning goals in the last 3 games. But when you read his book, it actually sounds very different from those 3. In his book, he does not go into a lot of detail about the games. He talks about them, but it's over very, very soon. In the rest of the book, it covers other grounds. And why is that? Because of the target audience and what Paul Henderson wants to do. Paul Henderson is a Christian. His goal in writing this book is to evangelize. Now, his claim to fame is his role in that series, so he has to use that as his jumping off point, but the goal of the book is to convince people Jesus is Lord. It's meant to be evangelistic. The other 3, well, they're written to hockey fans, describing the book. And that, folks, is the key to the difference. You see, 2 of the 4 gospel books do tell us who the target audience is. Luke, in his prologue, chapter 1, in verses 3 and 4, Luke writes, It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So, tell me about Luke's target audience here. Who is he writing to?
Theophilus.
Okay. What does that actually mean in Latin? It's a Latin name.
It sounds like someone who loves God. I mean, it sounds like a Greek name.
Yeah, loves God, loved by God. So it could be an actual person with that name. It could be a literary device where he sees just referring to everybody who reads his book as somebody who loves God. Now, what do we know about this Theophilus, whether it's an actual person or a literary device, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed? What does that tell us about Theophilus?
He's looking for evidence.
Would you say that he is a Christian or not a Christian?
Well, it sounds like he's already been instructed, so I guess he would already be a Christian.
Yeah. It seems clear Theophilus, the target audience of Luke, is somebody who's already a Christian and just needs to know the details, more details about the life of Jesus, his teachings, and so on. And because Luke, Matthew, and Mark are so similar, it stands to reason that they also have target audiences of Christians. And we have external evidence for that in regards to the Gospel according to Mark, for example, where Clement of Alexandria records for us that Mark was working with Peter in Rome. And when Peter left Rome, the church, that was still in Rome, wanted a record of Peter's teachings. And so they prevailed upon Mark to write this, and that became the Gospel according to Mark. So it seems Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written to people who are already Christians. What about John's target audience? In John 20, verse 31b, we read this. John gives us his reason for writing the book. He says, "These are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." What does that sound like to you?
Well, that you may believe, that indicates they don't already believe. So this would be to non-Christians.
This would be to non-Christians, and it's an evangelistic book. It's an evangelistic tract, if you will, a long one. He wants his readers to come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, so that they may have life in his name. So when we understand that John, alone of the four gospel books, was written as an evangelistic tract to non-Christians, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written as instructionals to Christians, the differences make perfect sense. It's the non-Christians for whom the most important thing to learn is who is Jesus. Learn his deity, learn about his incarnation, learn about how to be saved. So, of course, John is going to focus on these things. That's what you're going to focus on in an evangelistic tract. And so these differences are not problematic at all.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So it's not a mystery at all why John is different.
No. And really, any attempt to argue otherwise, to argue that they're irreconcilable, or that there's a problem in here, really is baseless. And as we said, it requires a very late date for the gospel according to John, and that is simply not the case.
Okay. So when was the gospel according to John published?
As we mentioned before, liberal scholars have tried to push the date of the gospel according to John as late as possible, originally into the latter part of the 2nd century AD, and then having to abandon this and settling for the latest possible part of the 1st century AD. It's not surprising to me that liberal scholars, liberal skeptics do this. What is surprising to me is that there's widespread agreement among evangelical scholars that this book was written in the AD 80s or 90s.
What? Why?
Well, let's look at the supposed evidence for such a late date. And there's a few lines of evidence that skeptics will bring up, and some of them evangelicals will not agree with. For example, number 1, in John chapter 9, verse 22, chapter 12, verse 42, chapter 16, verse 2, there's a mention of being put out of the synagogue, that the Jewish leaders had already sent out this decree that anyone who follows Jesus or champions him would be put out of the synagogue. And many scholars claimed that this idea and the terminology of being put out of the synagogue indicates that this book must have been written sometime after the decision made at the Council of Jamnia in the year 90 to ban Christians from the synagogue. So they find this expression occurring in the Gospel according to John, what they call an irreducible anachronism. That means out of proper time, and that dates the Gospel of John to a period after AD 85.
Oh, so people couldn't be put out of the synagogue before that council? Only after? They never used those words before?
Well, of course, you've hit the nail on the head here. The argument is a non-starter. Even if there were a universal ban issued at the Council of Jamnia in the year 90, it doesn't mean there could not have been local decisions in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus to put his followers out of the synagogue. And John is an eyewitness book, and he says this happened, and there's no evidence to say it hadn't. Furthermore, that argument was never more than speculation, and it's no longer valid because scholars have found that there's no actual evidence that a Council of Jamnia actually ever took place. And if there were, we have certainly no idea of what might have happened there, what might have been discussed there. So this argument really has collapsed. Now, a second argument that liberal scholars have brought up that generally is not accepted by evangelicals has to do with the Sadducees. The Sadducees were very influential before the year 70, but became insignificant after that date, became insignificant after the destruction of the temple, and these skeptics point out that the Sadducees are not mentioned at all in John's Gospel book, which indicates it must have been written after AD 70.
Well, if the focus of John's Gospel is to evangelize, is there even really a need to mention the Sadducees anyway?
No, there isn't. And again, you fit the nail on the head here. We have to look at the big picture. The scribes, for example, who are mentioned frequently in the other gospel books, they are mentioned at all by John. And yet the scribes didn't lose influence after AD 70. They became even more influential. So if that's the criterion, then the scribes should have been mentioned by John, and they're not. One could also point out that if you look at the Gospel according to Mark, which skeptics claim is the first Gospel book, the Sadducees are mentioned only once in the entire book. Ditto for the Gospel according to Luke, they're mentioned only once. And this makes it pretty clear that the attention paid to them by a Gospel writer cannot be considered a marker for the date of the writing. The third argument that skeptics have brought up is the so-called high Christology in the Gospel according to John, that there's very clear presentation of him as deity, his incarnation, his centrality and salvation. And the skeptics who reject the supernatural and insist that Jesus was just an ordinary man, an ordinary teacher, maybe a brilliant one, but just that, wouldn't have said these things about himself, and so these must have developed long after the death of the historical Jesus. And so the book must have been written as late as possible, albeit in the first century.
At least that one doesn't sound quite as stupid as the other arguments, I guess.
It seems to me it would be even more stupid because this is not an actual argument on any kind of factual basis. It's simply metaphysical bias. You have to assume that Jesus was just a man and not deity, and not the Savior, the way the Gospel books, entire New Testament presents him. So you have to assume that he's not in order to claim that these ideas were added later. So that's not evidence at all. As we say, it's metaphysical bias. But even if you answer a fool according to his folly, that argument still doesn't work, because these people will tell you that the earliest accounts, the earliest mentions we have of Jesus are in Paul's letters. And there's a comparable high Christology in Paul's letters. For example, the so-called Christ hymns in Philippians 2, 5-11, Colossians 1, 15-20, Romans 9, 5. You get an equally high view of Jesus in Paul's letters, which were already circulating in the mid-50s. So to use this as an argument to say that John had to come from the 90s, it just doesn't fly.
Well, why don't they then try to say that Paul's letters must have been written later, too?
They have no need to do that. They have other ways to attack Paul. The obvious one would be that, well, Paul, you see, wasn't an eyewitness to the risen Jesus, so he essentially made up all this stuff, and the gospel writers were then influenced by Paul. So you see, this is why it's very important to get the gospel book dates right. If, as we have demonstrated from the real evidence, the first three of them all predate Paul's letters, this scam of the liberal skeptics is not going to work. The idea that the gospel books were influenced by Paul, if the gospel books were actually written before Paul even came on the scene. This is why evangelicals really need to go back to the evidence, come up with evidence-based dating for the gospel books, not simply follow along with what becomes the industry consensus, which is very much influenced by liberal claims. Now, there are a couple of arguments that liberal skeptics bring up for late dating of the gospel according to John that for some reason evangelicals do like, and I'm not sure why. One of these has to do with the passage in John 21, verses 18 to 23, which reads this. Jesus speaking to Peter after 3 times asking, "Do you love me?" He says to Peter, "Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following, who also had leaned on his breast at the supper, and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "But Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Then this saying went out among the brethren, that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you?" John 21, 18 to 23. And you will find even evangelical scholars saying that the final part of this statement, John 21, 23, then this saying went out among the brethren, that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you?" They say that this points to a date for the book in the 90s. And my question is, how? How does it do that?
Yeah, it seems really random.
Yeah, it does seem strange. John 21, 18 to 19, we read that out where Jesus foretells the manner of Peter's death. It would be crucifixion. And the skeptics then, and evangelical scholars will say as well, the inference to be drawn from 21:19 is that Peter had, by his death, glorified God when chapter 21 was composed. Peter died in AD 64 or 65. Dates earlier than that for the composition of the fourth gospel seem unlikely. Now, I ask you, you've read this passage yourself many times. Would you draw that inference?
No, it seems like he's foretelling the future. So, what do you mean he had already glorified God by chapter 21?
Well, exactly. This is why the acceptance of this argument just seems so strange to me. This is a predictive prophecy by Jesus about the death of Peter. It has to be, because whenever the gospel according to John was written, this statement was still made by Jesus in the year 33. So it's definitely a predictive prophecy. Now, if Jesus could actually foretell the future so that a prophecy recorded in a gospel book need not have been fulfilled prior to the writing of the book, which evangelicals argue. You remember the liberal argument for late dating the gospel books to the year 70 and after is that there's predictive prophecy here by Jesus about the destruction of the temple. And they would say, no. The temple had to have been destroyed by the time this was written. Otherwise, Jesus would be doing genuine predictive prophecy, which we reject. But by the same token, Jesus here is doing predictive prophecy about the death of Peter. And the evangelical scholars will say, no, of course, the temple doesn't have to be destroyed by the time of writing because Jesus could foretell the future out of the other side of their mouths are saying, no, Peter must have died by this time. That's why it's in there. And that to me just does not make sense.
That's inconsistent.
It is absolutely inconsistent. Now, you'll say that, look, well, Matthew often cited a fulfilled prophecy. It would be uncharacteristic of him not to mention the destruction of the temple if it had already happened by that time. And they want to have a different standard for Matthew than for John. But it doesn't work. It's actually more certain in the case of John. Indeed, Matthew does record a number of fulfillments of prophecies from the Old Testament. John does also. But John also is the only gospel writer who cites the fulfillment of Jesus' own prophecies. In John 18:9 and John 18:32. In both of these passages, there's a prophecy made or referred to that Jesus himself had made, and it's recorded that this is fulfilled because Jesus had foretold it. If we look at John 18, verse 9, we read, starting at verse 8 actually, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. This is at his arrest. Verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. And then later in chapter 18, verse 32, so again, starting at verse 31, then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. So you have two clear passages in the Gospel according to John where Jesus' own prophecies were fulfilled, and mention is made of that. So you would think that if Jesus' prophecy about the death of Peter had already been fulfilled by the time the Gospel according to John was written, it certainly should have been mentioned that this fulfilled what he said. So why these evangelical scholars find an argument of this nature so compelling regarding a late date for the Gospel according to John, though they rejected for a late date of Matthew and Mark, is very difficult for me to understand.
Well, maybe they think that something like telling what kind of manner he would die is more predictable because people do get crucified in those days.
And yet the fulfillment of the prophecy in 1832 was about the very same issue, though in that case of Jesus' death, not Peter's, and that it was fulfilled. So it just seems to me that this is not an argument, saying not one an evangelical should make. And if you think those are bad, the arguments become just completely off the wall. One evangelical scholar suggests this, trying to justify a late date for the Gospel according to John, somewhere in the 90s. He says, during his ministry, Paul, of course, was the principal protagonist against heresy. For example, his letter to the Galatians. So if we take the view that John wrote to combat further heresy, it would be logical for there to have been a time gap of a couple of decades or so after the death of Paul for these heresies to have arisen and to have become somewhat established, that is, to have become worth refuting. Any comment on that?
Why does it take a long time for heresies to arise?
Well, that's a good question. Anything else?
What do you mean to become worth refuting?
That's another good point. There's so much wrong in this statement. Now, John, as we've said, told us. He gave his stated purpose in writing his gospel book, John 20:31. It is an evangelistic tract to introduce non-Christians to Jesus, who he is, what he did, what it means to us, how to be saved. It was not written as a refutation of heresy.
Although if you're telling people the true gospel, isn't that by nature refuting heresy?
Well, it will be a consequence of what you're saying, but it's not your purpose in doing it. The scholar says, if we take the view that John wrote to combat further heresy, the idea is giving is that, look, Paul was refuting heresy. Paul dies, nobody's around to do it. Heresies build up, so John jumps in the breach and writes this book to refute heresy. Is that why he wrote this book?
No.
No, absolutely not. Secondly, we have to ask this claim that Paul, of course, was the principal protagonist against heresy on the basis that he wrote a letter refuting a certain heresy that was threatening a church he himself had founded. Does he think that the other apostles were not also combating heresy during this time, but left it all to Paul? Do we not see, like in the letters of Peter, for example, and James, things that could be seen as addressing heresy? Third problem, does he really think that Paul managed to stamp out completely all heresies by the time of his death, and nothing else needed to be done for, quote, a couple of decades or so after the death of Paul? Does that sound at all reasonable to you? No, it doesn't. And again, just crazier and crazier arguments. This one from Brooke Foss Westcott of the infamous Westcott and Hort Greek New Testament. He writes this, quote, "No one can read the fourth gospel carefully without feeling that the writer occupies a position remote from the events which he describes."
Wait a minute, didn't you just quote a verse about how he leaned on his breast, the one whom Jesus loved, and he's right there?
Yes.
So how's he remote?
Well, that's Westcott says so. No one can read the fourth gospel carefully without feeling that the writer occupies a position remote from the events which he describes. However clear it is that he was an eyewitness of the life of the Lord, it is no less clear that he looks back upon it from a distance. Okay? So in other words, it must have been written late because we feel it's late. Okay? Now, you've read the Gospel according to John a number of times, haven't you?
Yeah.
And so have I. Did you ever, and you read it carefully, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, I would think so. Did you actually, as you were reading it, did you get the feeling that the writer was looking back upon the events from a distance?
No, and especially not after being reminded of that verse you just quoted.
He tries to back this up. He says, one plain proof of this is found in the manner in which he records words which point to the spread of the gospel beyond the limits of Judaism. In other words, it went out to the Gentiles.
How does that mean he was remote?
Well, he would say it takes a bit of time to get out to the Gentiles, but okay, it does. But let's look, for example, at Paul's letters. We know in the book of Acts how the gospel got to the Gentiles. Paul was an apostle tasked with bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. He didn't exactly do that wholeheartedly. He tended to go to the Jews first, but he did bring the gospel to the Gentiles, established many churches in the Gentile world, and he's not the one who did all of that either. In the epistle to the Romans that Paul wrote, it's clear that there's a very large, prosperous church with a lot of Gentiles in it in the city of Rome. And he's writing around the year 57. So certainly by 57 and earlier, the gospel spread far beyond the limits of Judaism. So if it's done that by the year 57, how can you say that spreading beyond the limits of Judaism puts you into 95?
You can't.
You can't. Okay? It just makes no sense. So these are the arguments for late dating of the Gospel according to John that just do not work.
Are there any more plausible arguments?
There's one. Okay? There's one that could be considered good, and this really, I think, trumps all the rest of them. This is the one that most evangelicals will go with. And it's like this. There seems to be a common belief that this late dating is strongly supported by the early Christian writers. One scholar puts it this way: the church fathers are most persuasive evidence for the date of John, and they unanimously ascribe a later date to John, written when he was a very old man. Does that sound like a viable argument?
Well, how old was he when the events took place?
Well, he must have been pretty young when they took place if he lived into the 90s. But prima facie, this would be a good argument, and we do have to take the testimony of the early church fathers seriously, which we have been doing. These are people in contact with sources of information long since lost to us. Some of the church fathers were students of the apostles themselves, or students of men who had been trained by the apostles. So their testimony definitely has to carry a lot of weight. So this would be a really good argument for late dating of the Gospel according to John, if it were actually true. But it isn't. Okay? It isn't true. There is testimony, a pretty good amount of testimony that John lived to an old age, but not that he wrote his gospel book at an old age. They seem to be conflating the two. The testimony that he wrote it at an old age is so weak, it can be discounted absolutely. There's a scholar named John A.T. Robinson, and he wrote a landmark book published back in 1976. It was called Redating the New Testament. The interesting thing here is that Robinson was not a believer. Robinson was a liberal. Robinson was a flaming liberal scholar, and he decided to write a book about how we know when the gospel books were written. And he went into that assuming all of those late dates we've talked about. And he was just going to marshal into one book all the ways we know this, all the evidence. Well, by his own testimony, he found himself shocked. He found himself shocked by the fact that these arguments were based on what we called scholarly sloth, failure to examine presuppositions, and so on. When he started looking through the evidence, he found that they're absolutely wrong. Gospel books were much earlier than was the consensus among scholarship, and particularly liberal scholars. Now, as far as I know, he didn't become a Christian, but he presented the evidence as it is. And regarding the late date of the Gospel according to John, he said Epiphanius, the fellow named Epiphanius, was the first church father to assert that John was written late. And Epiphanius lived about 315 to the year 403. So he's 370 years or so after Jesus' time. He's not really in a position to know. So that's very late testimony, and it's the first we have, and he's not trustworthy. As Robinson points out, Epiphanius combined this claim of a late date with the confused statements that John's banishment took place under the Emperor Claudius. And Claudius, when was Claudius emperor? 41 to 58, was it? And that he prophesied under that emperor before his death. So he obviously really had his dates mixed up. Epiphanius. And then, so you really can't trust Epiphanius. And nobody else says that John was written late until a fellow called Georgius Hamartolus in the 9th century. And then still later in something called the Papias legend. So there is, in fact, no reliable testimony among the early Christian writers that John wrote his gospel book at an old age. That idea is so widespread, they unanimously ascribe a later date to John, written when he was a very old man. That idea has taken on legs, and people repeat it, but they don't bother to check.
So I guess we can only trust early church fathers, not ones who write a few hundred years after the fact.
Well, it depends. It depends on what sources of information they could be counted on to have access to. If you look at somebody like Eusebius, for example, who was writing about 100 years before Epiphanius, he was a historian. His job was to put together an accurate history as far as he could. We know he had access to a lot of very early information that we don't. Papias, for example, whom we've mentioned, who talks about the authorship of Matthew and Mark, writing around the year 100, he actually wrote 5 big books on the early history of the church and these things. All that's come down to us are a few fragments, recorded in quotations of different later writers. But Eusebius had access to all 5 books and to a lot of other information. So certainly, the earlier the writers are, the more you can give them credence, and the further away you get, the less. But again, you have to look at the quad in each case. Eusebius, for example, much of what he writes, he backs up by quotations from much earlier writers, like Papias and Irenaeus. And so you look at signs of reliability. As we said with Epiphanius, he talks about a late date for John, yet for him, his late date is in the reign of Claudius. 41 to 54. So that kind of disqualifies him from being very reliable.
So are there any good arguments for a much earlier date than 80 to 95?
I think there are. So yeah, here's where we stand now. We're looking at what's the date for the gospel according to John. We don't really know. Obviously 95 or thereabouts would be a latest possible date, or whenever John died. 33 would be the earliest possible date when the events described in the book finished. But can we pin it down? Attempts to pin it to later dates, as we've seen, just fail. There's no good basis for later dates. But what about for earlier dates? Is there anything solid that we can hang our hats on? Well, one argument that came up commonly is John uses the present tense to describe places in Jerusalem. For example, in John 5:2, where he talks about the pool at Bethesda and describes it, says there is a pool in Jerusalem. He's describing it as if they're still standing, which would therefore put it before the Jewish War, AD 66 to 70. So definitely would be a pre-70 date. But you're some expertise in Greek. Do you find a problem with that argument?
Well, oftentimes when people are writing narratives, they use a historic present. So using present tense, but it's obvious from the context that it's describing past events. Like, they'll say things like, Jesus says to them. Obviously, he's not saying it to them now. He said it to them, but that's just the way they write. Maybe, I guess, as I've heard, to make things more vivid or something.
Yes, and we do the same thing in English. We use what's called a historic present. For example, I might say, wow, you should have seen what happened to me yesterday. What happened? Well, see, I was in the store. See, this guy comes up to me and he says to me, so-and-so, and then I say to him, you see, I've switched into present there. It's just a narrative form.
But the listener knows that it's not actually happening now.
Exactly, because I said, you should have heard what happened to me yesterday. And other languages do this as well. You see the same thing in Hungarian, for example. So that might impress people who don't know much about Greek or languages in general. But it's not a good argument because John does frequently use this historic present. Okay? So although that's not a good argument for an earlier date, there are other ones that are good.
What are they?
Well, let's start with internal evidence. Okay? And we'll bring up the same thing that we brought up for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that there's no mention in the Gospel according to John of the destruction of the temple.
But you said the prophecy of the destruction of the temple was not recorded in the Gospel according to John.
Well, it isn't. And I said that makes it not quite as straightforward as it would for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in fact, evangelical scholars like D.A. Carson actually reject this line of argument. Carson writes, how prominent the temple was in the thinking of Jews in the diaspora varied a great deal. If some time had elapsed, perhaps a decade, between the destruction of the temple and the publication of this gospel, so that the initial shock of the reports had passed, there's no reason to think that the evangelist should have brought it up. Indeed, John is a writer who loves subtle allusions. If he wrote in, say, 80, he may have taken the destruction of the temple as a given and let this fact make its own contribution to his theological argument, unquote. Does that sound reasonable?
What subtle allusions are they talking about?
You know, I'm not sure there's anything that would really fit the bill for this particular argument. And it seems circular to me as well. Like, if it's written late, then he wouldn't mention it. He doesn't mention it, so it's written late. It sounds to me very much like a circular argument. And it really doesn't fit. Compare it, for example, to 9/11. Is the initial shock of 9/11 gone? You might perhaps say it is, but it's certainly not something that people have forgotten. We just marked the 20th anniversary of it. 20 years have gone by, and it's still, in the living memory of people, it's still something that does impinge upon their thoughts.
But you don't expect to hear about it in every document that we write now.
No, you don't expect to hear about it in every document that you write now, but the temple, the destruction of the temple, and what happened around it was so much more significant for the Jews than even 9/11 was to the Americans or to the world at large. Remember that the temple was God's house. It was the very center and locus of God's presence with his people, the central point of their religion, where they went to make sacrifices. When it was destroyed, it was part of the destruction of the entire city of Jerusalem, maybe more than 1 million Jewish people killed at the time. I'm not thinking that in 10 years the shock was kind of worn off to the point where it's just, I really don't think so.
But if everybody knew about it, why would you expect him to specifically mention it?
Here's why. As we've mentioned before, the strength of an argument from silence varies directly with the level of expectation that the missing thing should be mentioned, were it known. In the case of the Synoptic Gospels, they record Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple, and so its fulfillment should certainly have been recorded if it had happened by the time of writing. Now, it's not recorded in Gospel according to John, but that does not mean there are no passages in this book that would call for the mention of the destruction of the temple were it known. And that's the thing we have to look for. Are there such places that would tell us that, yeah, it should at this point be mentioned if it had happened? And when we look, we find 3 places in John's book where we would reasonably expect that the destruction of the temple would have been mentioned had it already happened. The first such place is in John 2:18-21. This is after Jesus did his first cleansing of the temple. The Jewish leaders are livid about it. And they go to him, and we read, "So the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show to us, since you do these things?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said."
Well, that seems to make it pretty obvious that the temple wasn't destroyed yet.
It would seem so. Okay? Now, some would say this is a saw-off. One could argue that John specified that Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body rather than the temple building to counter the accusation that he had failed to carry out his promise to destroy the temple. But that's an accusation that could only be made before AD 70, so it still sets the gospel book to before 70, because that accusation could only be made while the temple was still standing. On the other hand, one could argue that John was trying to counter the accusation that Jesus had failed to fulfill his promise to rebuild the temple in 3 days after its destruction, an accusation that could only be made after AD 70. So perhaps these 2 possibilities might cancel each other out, but there's another point to be made here. It is a fact that one of the accusations levied against the Christians from the beginning in Jerusalem was that their leader had threatened to destroy the temple building. You see that, for example, in Stephen's trial in Acts chapter 6, verses 13-14. And a charge like that would no doubt have made the Christians seem dangerous to the Jewish authorities, but only before AD 70.
How can you threaten to destroy the temple if it's already destroyed?
Well, yeah, exactly. So apropos to this, and not only does it seem that Jesus may have been trying to deflect this accusation by pointing out that Jesus wasn't threatening to destroy the temple building, but we could also expect that had the temple already been destroyed by this time, John would have pointed out that it was not Jesus, but the Romans who had done it. So we would expect at this point, if the temple had been destroyed, a mention of it. That's the first place where we would expect that. A second such place is in John 4:19-21, and this takes place during Jesus' conversation with a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in Sychar. And we read here, "The woman said to him, 'Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship.'" Now, that place is the temple, obviously. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." Now, Jerusalem had been selected by God himself as the place of worship and the place for his temple, the epicenter of Jewish worship. You see that in Deuteronomy 12:5, for example, 1 Kings 11:36. The idea that Jerusalem would one day no longer be that epicenter was a non-starter to Jews. So certainly here, John would have mentioned the destruction of the temple and the devastation of the Jews by the Romans, which went a long way towards ending worship in Jerusalem, to prove that what Jesus said was exactly right. And why? At a minimum, it showed that such a thing was indeed a viable possibility. So here's the second place we would expect it to be mentioned in John if it had already happened. The third such place is in John 11:47-52, where we read this. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So, this passage calls out for mention of the destruction not only of the temple, but of the Jewish place and nation. The high priest here seems to be prophesying that Jesus would die instead of the Jewish nation. And we said that the Romans will come and take away both our place in our nation. So if Jesus died for them, the Romans wouldn't do that. Jesus did die, and yet the Romans did destroy the place and nation. So at this point, that would require a word of explanation if it had already happened by that time. Seeming contradiction virtually demands an explanatory note, and we can fully expect that John would have provided one had the destruction already come to pass. The absence of such a comment indicates that this gospel book was written prior to AD 70, the time of that destruction.
So how would you explain the seeming contradiction?
Well, because the high priest was wrong. The one man did die for the nation. He died for the sins of the nation, for their salvation. But with his death, it brought an end to the old covenant. As we read in Hebrews, the old covenant is obsolete. It's passing away. It's gone. The temple as the epicenter of that covenant being destroyed meant it's now no question. There's no way to continue the old covenant. You can only go to the new. So it wasn't really a contradiction. It was seeming, but it wasn't. Because the priest said, well, if we get rid of Jesus, the Romans won't trash our place. Well, yeah, he has no authority to make that pronouncement. They did kill Jesus. One man did die for the nation. But later on, judgment came. And the Romans did indeed take away their place and nation. So, what have we seen then? While Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple is not recorded by John, the absence of its mention is nevertheless significant at not one but three separate places. Even if we would say, well, there's only a 50-50 chance that John would mention it at each place, it's actually much higher as we've seen, there still would be like an 88% chance that John would mention it in at least one of the passages. So this seems to be some reasonably strong internal evidence for an earlier date, a date before AD 70.
Is there external evidence too?
Yes, there is. The family 35 colophons. We mentioned this when we were talking about the dates of the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke. Family 35 colophons are little footnotes, endnotes, if you will, that are written in these manuscripts, about 150 of them, where at the end of each Gospel book it says when it was written. And it terms it in the sense of how many years after the ascension of Jesus. As we saw, it said Matthew 8 years after the ascension, Mark 10 years after the ascension, Luke 15 years after the ascension. And we also read that John was published 32 years after the ascension, which would take it to around the year 65. And that fits in nicely with what we've seen. It is the latest gospel book, which means it will come after Luke, so after 49, but before the destruction of the temple. So somewhere between 49 and 69. 65 is where it comes in at. Now, as we mentioned before, the family 35 colophons are written in these manuscripts, which come from the Middle Ages, so they're relatively late manuscripts. The fact that they're so widespread, though, leads scholars like Pickering to argue they must go back to at least the 3rd century. And we pointed out that in the case of Matthew and Mark, he gives specific dates for their publication, not in terms of years after the ascension, but in the year of the emperor, which suggests he's getting it from a different source. And yet his dates for Matthew and Mark dovetail precisely with the dates we have in the family 35 colophons, which therefore makes them seem credible. So there's no good reason to doubt them regarding the date of Gospel according to John.
Well, it sounds like then it's not really the family 35 colophons that themselves are the evidence, but Eusebius's writings are the evidence.
Eusebius gives specific dates for Matthew and Mark, not for Luke or John. And family 35 colophons give us the date for all four. But since Eusebius dates, which, as I say, seems to be drawn from a different source because it's expressed in a different way, since they line up perfectly with the dates for Matthew and Mark in the family 35 colophons, gives us strong reason to believe the family 35 colophons are accurate. So we can accept their testimony regarding Luke and John, even though Eusebius does not give us specific dates for those.
Okay, so can you summarize the gospel dates for us?
Sure. Based on the actual evidence that we've looked through, not on bald assertions, not on consensus, not on I have a PhD, trust me, we've come to the conclusion that Matthew was published in the year 40 or 41, Mark in 42 to 43, Luke in 48 to 49, and John around the year 65. Interestingly enough, remember, liberals would want to push Mark as the first, written around AD 70, and they may go as early as AD 66, which means that in reality, the last gospel book was published before the date at which liberals say the first one was published. We've seen that the liberal case for this dating is built on sand. It's not based on any actual evidence, but bald assertions. Why evangelical scholars simply go along with this and don't challenge it and don't re-examine the evidence for themselves is really something that I just cannot fathom. But they shouldn't be doing it. The gospel books are our primary evidence for Jesus, and we should be going to the wall to defend their reliability. We should do that on the basis of the plethora of evidence available to us.
Well, thank you for enlightening us on this very important topic, John. I hope to hear more from you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.